All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Friday afternoon. I'm Carrie Tirado Brayman, Director of the University of Buffalo's Gender Institute and a professor in English. And before we get started with today's event, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land upon which the University of Buffalo operates, which is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. Today's event is part of a new series at the Gender Institute that we started this academic year called New Books, New Feminist Directions. And this series has been really successful because colleagues both here and elsewhere have taken the time to recognize the amazing feminist research happening here at UB. And it's not just a recognition of this research, but it's also a serious engagement with the ideas, the debates, and the labor that has produced these important works. So today I'm really thrilled to be concluding the first year of the series with Jasmina Tumbas's brilliant new book, Am Jugoslovenka, Feminist Performance Politics During and After Yugoslav Socialism, published by Manchester University Press this year in their Rethinking Arts History series, co-edited by Amelia Jones, who we have with us today, and Marcia Meskimen. We also have posted in the chat box the discount code at Manchester University Press, which they have provided for us to purchase Jasmina's book. So I first discovered Jasmina's work on the topic of Yugoslav feminist and queer art and performance at a lecture she gave as part of the Humanities Institute a few years ago. And since then, I've been waiting with great anticipation to read her book. And I can assure you it was worth the wait. The book is a fantastic study of the renaissance of feminist and queer art in the 1970s and 1980s under the open socialism of Yugoslavia. The book invites us to reassess the meaning of totalitarian in the context of its feminist and queer artists, and it also invites us to reflect on what it means to identify as Jugoslovenka, with a nation that no longer exists. Jasmina Tumbas received her PhD in art history at Duke in 2012, and she received an MA at the Savannah College of Art and Design in 2006. She is a soon-to-be associate professor of contemporary art history and performance studies and director of graduate studies in the Department of Global Gender and Sexuality Studies at UB. And she is currently working on a second book called Feminists of the Yugoslav Diaspora, Art and Resistance Beyond Citizenship and Nationhood. Jasmina has published widely on a range of topics from Carl Palladino's hate speech to Yugo nostalgia, and she has edited and translated works on the Roma in Europe. I'm delighted to introduce Amelia Jones, who will offer commentary on Dr. Tumbas's book. Dr. Amelia Jones is Robert A. Day Professor and Vice Dean at Roski School of Art and Design at USC. Her publications include Sing Differently, A History and Theory of Identification and the Visual Arts, and Otherwise, Imagining Queer Feminist Art Histories, co-edited with Aaron Silver. The catalog Queer Communion, Ron Athey, co-edited with Andy Campbell, and which accompanies a retrospective of Athey's work. And the catalog was listed among the best art books of 2020 in the New York Times, and the exhibition was listed among the top 10 2021 exhibitions in Art Forum in December 2021. Her most recent book is In Between Subjects, A Critical Genealogy of Queer Performance, published in 2021 by Routledge. And our final discussant for today is Dr. Lindsay Brandon Hunter, Associate Professor of Theater and Performance Studies in the Department of Theater and Dance and affiliate faculty with the Department of Global Gender and Sexuality Studies at UB. And Lindsay's research sits at the juncture of theater, media, and performance studies. Her book, Playing Real, Media, Mimesis, and Mischief, was published in 2021 by Northwestern University Press and examines the performances of authenticity and realness in contexts as varied as reality TV, alternative reality gaming, and live broadcast theater. And her essay, We Are Not Making a Movie, Constituting Theater and Live Broadcast, won the American Theater and Higher Education Prize for Outstanding Article in 2019. And her writing has appeared in a variety of journals, from theater topics to an online journal called A Modern. So welcome all of you, and I'm going to hand it right over to you, Jasmina.
Okay, thank you so much for all these wonderful introductions. As you see, I'm in an incredibly accomplished company, and I'm very, very happy to be here. I want to thank the Gender Institute, especially Kara Bremen, for the invitation to present this book, and as Robbie Pond and Rebecca Berg for helping organize every little aspect of the event. It's also really wonderful and frankly overwhelming to see so many familiar faces and names and of colleagues and friends I haven't seen in years from all over the world. I'm grateful for your time and for this technology, this Zoom technology, which will allow me to share this book with you. I also want to offer special thanks to Amelia Jones, who, as you know, is the editor of Manchester University Press's excellent series, Rethinking Arts Histories. I'm deeply grateful to be part of the series. Thank you also, of course, Lindsay Hunter, a dear colleague in performance studies and feminism at UB. I'm honored to be in conversation with both of you, and of course, with the rest of you after as well. Most importantly, and I wanted to make sure I say this, I also want to thank all the artists and feminists who inspired this book and who shared their time and work with me, and the cultural workers from the region who have for decades created discourses around the issues that fascinated and continue to fascinate me. And huge thanks, especially to those whose tireless work to create and maintain the very archives and libraries that made this research and book possible. My talk today will take about 30 minutes, and it will be focused on showing a visual argument that explicates feminist motives, desires, and forms of resistance in the socialist Yugoslav context during its disintegration in the 90s and up to today. As my book centers feminist methodologies in field of embodied and visual art and culture, the talk today will highlight some of the examples in my book and elucidate how and why I came to research the significance of Jugoslovenka and feminist performance politics during the socialist period, and why she, as a figure, might still be relevant today. Let me make sure I can click through. Okay, so let's begin with a little bit of background first, especially for those of you who are less familiar with the dense and complicated history of a country which, of course, no longer exists. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia represents one of the most intriguing and paradoxical examples of women's emancipatory power during the 20th century socialist period. One of the most politically West-leaning of the socialist countries during the Cold War, Yugoslavia became a place where new trends in avant-garde art flourished, while Marxism held sway, anti-fascist ideology reigned in tandem with sex and rock and roll, and women enjoyed more legal rights and social mobility, including access to education and labor mobility, than in any other or most other East European and some Western countries. How could this be, you might ask, if the East was such a grim place, if we want to believe the Cold War rhetoric? Why was Yugoslavia so exceptional? One answer lies within its anti-fascist, partisan, and extremely charismatic leader, Tito, who united the Yugoslav Republic, but whose persona was also deeply tied to the more free and sexually liberated ideologies underpinning the socialist Yugoslav project. This is, I think, a very cleverly thematized, this idea of the charismatic leader and the libidinal aspects of Yugoslav socialism is very cleverly thematized in one of my favorite works of art, showing the fearless, thoughtful, and elegant leader wearing a signature suit here, cutting through the Nazi flag with his huge sword. But the reality of how Yugoslavia won their battle against fascism in World War II actually has a different hero, the partisan woman fighters. Here you see a photograph of Vera Krisman, who was known as a Nazi killer, wearing the partisan uniform and standing next to a black and white photograph of Tito. And there were many more heroines, such as the two Yugoslav partisans you see on your right, who already as teenagers were fighting against fascism in the midst of war. Women were not only busy fighting fascists as soldiers on the ground, but they also made time to organize themselves. They founded the Anti-Fascist Front of Women of Yugoslavia in the midst of World War II in 1942 and had over 2 million members by the end of the war. Here you see the famous Katapanovic, who was the president of the Anti-Fascist Front of Women of Yugoslavia, speak to a large crowd in liberated Zagreb in 1945. With the victory over fascism and the establishment of socialist Yugoslavia came many progresses for women. Now get ready for this list. In August 1945, women were legally declared equal to men. As early as 1951, lesbian sex was decriminalized. And by 1977, homosexuality was decriminalized. Abortion was legalized in 1952, and paid maternity leave and the right to divorce were socially and legally accepted by the 1950s. Let's let that sink in, given what is currently happening, of course, even in the United States. In fact, as early as 1928, some 17 years before the founding of Yugoslavia, Tito, its leader, who would become, of course, the president of Yugoslavia, had distributed a flyer declaring that women were essential to fighting the bourgeois imperialist war and invited them to join the Communist Party in large numbers to, quote, fight till the end for the liberation of the working class, end quote. Already in 1936, the magazine Žena danas, Woman Today, was founded, and its first issue, titled Novi Feminism, New Feminism, emphasized that, quote, the fight for women's rights is the fight against fascism, end quote. And also in the 1930s, this photograph was taken, dressed in what could easily be perceived as a femme and butch lesbian fashions, and holding hands, the two women in this photograph not only prefigure a robust generation of straight and lesbian feminists essential to the anti-fascist socialist cause in Yugoslavia, but they invite a more urgent look at the many unnamed feminists in Yugoslavia's art history. The closeness of their bodies, the tender way in which they hold hands, and the confidence and bravado with which they look in the camera activate feminist and queer emancipatory readings, often overlooked in the impossible histories of Yugoslav art. In fact, crowning the introduction to Dubravka Đurić and Miško Šuvakovic's edited volume, Impossible Histories, Historical Avant-Gardes, Neo-Avant-Gardes, and Post-Avant-Gardes in Yugoslavia, signifies just how important feminism was in the region for the arts, even before the advent of Tito's Yugoslavia. And this is actually a photograph of my copy of the book that I've used since I was in graduate school, and an absolutely indispensable resource for anyone working in this field. And as I was revisiting this volume, I noticed this amazing photograph, which only held the simple caption, "Two Belgrade Feminists." Although they're prominently placed at the beginning of one of the most important books on the region, they remain unnamed, but are far from irrelevant. Further research with the help of legendary lesbian writer and activist Suzana Tratnik and Šuvaković himself, I found out that the butch woman is Šuvakovic's mother's aunt, Ljuba Petković, who was a graphic worker and who died young. The point is that I realized that one of the most prolific writers on the region, Šuvaković, his own history is deeply entwined with the history of feminism, here tied to a mysterious photograph which manifests the under-recognized but powerful emancipatory legacy of women in the Yugoslav region. My own mother is one of these under-recognized, emancipated women who raised me, here donning an 80s haircut, I think it's a mullet, a plaid button-up blouse with a white collar and a white tie and a black blazer, without a doubt, an outfit she made herself. Donning, of course, as I said, this short haircut and a confident gaze. I include this photograph because my own connection to Yugoslavia and how I was raised is deeply tied to why and how I pursued this project. You can see here that my mother felt no pressure to give me a girly haircut or to make me smile. As such, how we are taught to embody gender expression and gender expectations and how we dress and present ourselves in the world is part of what drives my analysis in this book and how I see the emancipatory strength of feminist performance politics. These photos are not included in the book, but they're here for you. As a historian of art and visual culture, my research was driven by the question of what we might learn from a visual history of women's emancipation and the feminist movement evident in art and culture during Yugoslav socialism. How does an explication of feminist performance politics provide an essential narrative about a nation that since then has perished, but which remains the foundation for the work of feminist artists, theorists, and historians from the region? And what does the difficult story of socialist Yugoslavia and its disintegration in the 1990s tell us about both the generative but also problematic parts of that political system, such as the persistence of gender-based violence and patriarchal values? My book is devoted to analyzing the work of feminist leaders and as protagonists within the Yugoslav art context, following the bold and visual provocation posed by Sanja Vekovic's revision of the Yugoslav flag, Nova Zvezda, New Star, in 1983, which you see here, in which the artist replaced the signature red socialist star with the hair arranged in the triangular shape of a female pubis. In Vekovic's flag, Jugoslovenka bridges a fascinating paradox of providing a platform for understanding feminist emancipation in Yugoslav culture, while the country also remained staunchly patriarchal, as this was not its official flag. Yugoslavia's history is not one of victorious challenges against women's oppression. While I've spent some considerable time today already showing you some of the amazing examples of feminist emancipation, it is important to note that as early as 1953, all this extraordinary advancement for women led the male-dominated Yugoslav communist elite to declare that it had reached its goal of the liberation of women, and that feminism was thus obsolete, not just obsolete, but as a political movement, that it ran counter the larger goal of the liberation of the people and was therefore self-interested and divisive. And of course, we know these arguments even today. The Anti-Fascist Front of Women of Yugoslavia was abolished in 1953, actually also self-abolished, and many women were asked to retreat back into the sphere of the home. Prominent Yugoslav feminist theorist Rade Vekovic blamed the patriarchal mentality of the Yugoslav system for fostering confusion by legally announcing women's equality while asking women to perform household duties and keeping them from advancing in Yugoslavia's self-management system. This was disappointing considering the fact that in the first 2 decades of the Yugoslav project, the idea of the partisan Jugoslovenka, partizanka, as you saw at the beginning of my presentation, and here are some more examples, had, quote, emerged as an eminent source of legitimacy for Tito's Yugoslavia and a symbol of supranational Yugoslavism, end quote. But by the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s, historian Jelena Batinic has noted the image of the partizanka, the female partisan heroine, quote, was shaped by an ever-growing dose of misogyny and sexism. By superseding the Red Star then with female genitalia after a decade of feminist work in the 1970s and just 3 years after the death of Tito in 1980, Ivekovic's flag connoted both profound insight and foresight. Yugoslav socialism not only owed its inception to women, but the country and its unity depended on women's leadership to persist, as if to imply that Yugoslavia ought to have looked to women for emancipatory politics and not the male-centered patriarchal nationalism so pervasive and destructive in the 1980s. And here it is important to stop for a moment and note that the Yugoslav dream of women's emancipation was not the only political aspect that was fragile. The unity itself of Yugoslavia was threatened by nationalist tensions, which escalated into the Yugoslav wars. This week on April 6th, it was the 30-year anniversary of the siege of Sarajevo. And here you see just some of the photos from that extremely difficult time. And as we see, these horrific events unfold in Ukraine, we have also seen the emergence of many of the survivors of the Yugoslav wars. Here are just two examples, who have now shared their important and under-acknowledged stories. Genocide scholar and law professor Elimana Memišević, who also visited UB recently and who fled Visegrad during this very difficult time as a young girl, has been fighting against the erasure of this genocide. So even though all of this genocide happened and all of this violence happened, a lot of the people who were committing those acts are still in power and live freely. But to return to Iveković again, a work made a decade before the explosion of ethnic violence, and to push the analysis, although there were always tensions, I don't want to mislead, but before the war really, and to push this analysis of her flag even further, it could be argued that Iveković's feminist flag established feminism's kinship to the transnational and multi-ethnic politics of socialist Yugoslavia, and that in the 1970s and 1980s, it was women who transported this legacy of pacifism, communism, and anti-nationalism and strove for a more just and egalitarian society, as if to replace Yugoslavia's great socialist mantra of brotherhood and unity with the feminist sisterhood and unity. This idea of sisterhood and unity, resisting the ethnic cleansing and divisive politics of war, is also what led me to write about Yugoslavia and her legacy in my book, and to extend it beyond when the wars were happening. So let me just give you a quick glimpse into my table of contents, and perhaps give you a few examples of how I approach these works and analyze works. The chapters in this book offer case studies of feminist performance politics, emancipatory work within 5 frames of reference. Chapter 1. In Chapter 1, I focus on the avant-garde circles in the 1970s and 1980s in major cities such as Belgrade, Zagreb, and Ljubljana, and single out specific artworks that put the complicated history of feminist resistance into dialogue with performance and body-centered work by women artists. Here you see a few examples of artists playing with flags, and on the left, showing a work again by Sanja Iveković, and these are directly out of my book. I cut off Katalin Mladic's caption, I just realized. So on the left, you see Sanja Iveković, who's playing and who offers a sardonic critique of Tito's omnipotent gaze. And on the right, you see Katalin Mladic's work. It's called Cheating Paper. So it's a lie. The Yugoslav flag is critiqued as a lie. And then also at the bottom, I included this work by Zoran Popović, who inserted the contours of his wife's body, that of art historian and curator Jasna Tijardović, into the horizontal middle white stripe of the flag. This work is deeply relevant because Popović made the drawing on March 8, 1971, on International Women's Day, a critical holiday in Yugoslavia honoring women workers across the nation and worldwide. And Tijardović appears as Jugoslovenka personified, with the Yugoslav's red star crowning her vaginal area, her face emerging in the blue of the flag. In her 1981 visual Orgasm, Delamar libidinally charged the flag as a site of bed under socialism, arranged as a grid of 12 black and white photographs of the artist's face grimacing in pleasure during masturbation. The images show Delamar on her back in a bed with her head on a large white pillow. The grid lines are made of blue embroidery while her lips are painted pinkish red. In my view, this added coloration evokes the colors of the Yugoslav flag, blue and white stripes with a red star in the middle. Yet clearly the pinkish red lips stand in for a very different political agenda than the red socialist star in the Yugoslav flag, not socialist brotherhood and unity, and not even its imagined feminist equivalent of sisterhood. Instead, Delamar's visual Orgasm is a radical investment in individual women's right for joy and sexual pleasure, wrapped in delicate embroidery with the moaning pink mouth at the center of this reconfigured iconic political emblem. Chapter 2 turns, so this is just one example, I'll just give you really a little example. Chapter 2 turns towards 3 superstars in culture whose careers were launched in Yugoslavia. Lepa Brena, Esma Rečepova, and Marina Abramovic. This chapter puts these three women's varied relationships to questions of emancipation in Yugoslavia into conversation and unfolds the complicated position of Orientalism in Yugoslav culture through their individual performance works. All three women were firsts in their fields, achieving breakthroughs previously unattainable for women within the Yugoslav context. While Abramovic changed the history of performance art in the elite echelons of the local and global arts world from the 1970s on, and you see her here on the left holding a portrait of Tito, again, many years after he's already passed. And Lepa Brena conquered popular culture, starting out in the small kafanas, the bars and restaurants that played live music of Yugoslavia, before erupting into a megastar who toured sold-out stadiums in neighboring socialist states in the 1980s with unprecedented and lasting success. So to give you an example, my uncle met Lepa Brena before she was really, really famous, because he was also a musician, but then by the 80s, she was absolutely had exploded. In fact, the title of this book is inspired by and indebted to Lepa Brena's 1989 song and music video, Jugoslovenka. I have it also in my PowerPoint. We can look at it later if time allows. This is a very signature song, which of course connotes kind of the longevity of the project. But moving on, achieving international success and exposure and earning the title of Queen of Romani Music, Rečepova, the third of this powerful set of Jugoslovenkas, began her career much earlier than Abramovic and Brena. Already at age 18, she found herself singing in front of none other than Tito in 1961 during the legendary First Non-Alignment Conference in Belgrade. In 1976, Rečepova performed in front of Indira Gandhi in India, representing Yugoslavia as the first at the first World Festival of Romani Songs and Music. This chapter shows how all these three women represented Yugoslavia in divergent ways during the socialist period and after. And here, of course, you see Esma Rečepova wearing the Yugoslav colors, but she also, and I talk about this in the chapter, was very aware of the racism against the ethnic minority Roma in Yugoslavia. So she's also a very interesting case of thinking through questions of Yugoslavia being othered, or people in Yugoslavia being othered, and then ethnic Roma being othered within that othering process. But we can talk about that more. In chapter 3, the emergence of a queer Jugoslovenka is front and center, including a discussion of her context in the 1980s and her legacy into our present moment. This chapter gives a visual history of the Yugoslav lesbian and queer movement and traces its influences in contemporary visual culture and art, including the surfacing of transgender resistance and queer life in rural areas. So here you just see a couple of these examples. Chapter 3 also argues that after Tito's death, the punk and gay and lesbian underground scenes did not abandon the political project of socialism, but were critical of its conservative aspects, including the patriarchal nationalism, which was on the rise and threatened the emancipatory movements of anti-fascist resistance pushed by Yugoslav women. And here you just see a couple of examples of the amazing alternative work from the 1980s. But I wanted to sort of hone in on one example here. Feminist and queer politics were deeply at stake in critiquing the nationalist context. Oh, I'm just going to play this without sound. One example comes from Marina Abramovic and Aina Schmidt's video work by Locations, a work in which the symbol of the Yugoslav star took on an ominous meaning. The video work marks the end of the decade just before the wars began. Virginitz and Schmidt inserted the figure of the socialist woman in used footage that TV Slovenia had filmed in the South Serbian autonomous region of Kosovo during the uprisings that followed Slobodan Milosevic's crackdown on basic human rights for Kosovo Albanians. TV Slovenia did not air this material at the time. Thus, by Locations uniquely bore witness to the injustices happening in Kosovo. It is part of an even smaller group of works, the only one to my knowledge, that centered the politics of looking at that conflict, the political gaze, within the agency of the socialist woman. Her body here is chroma keyed, a technique which allows scenes of violence in Kosovo behind her to be visible past the outline of her body, as well as through a round area around her left eye, erased from her face. And I'll just replay. As several other parts of her body are also effaced. The gray color of her clothes echoes the dark, industrial, polluted ground of Kosovo, accentuating the contrasting cleanliness of her guise and white skin. As politicians in black suits arrive and leave in Mercedes-Benz on the streets of the uprisings in the working class district of Kosovo, the dull gray ground is pierced by the bright red of a tiny Mercedes-Benz logo at the front of the hood of the car. This is the most important turn of the symbol of the star relevant for 1990, as it signals the new and nefarious branding of socialist ideology by corrupt politicians to cloak their nationalist and genocidal politics at the time, especially Slobodan Milosevic, who still considered himself a great Yugoslav when he advocated for Serbian nationalism and the genocide of Kosovo Albanians. Jugoslovenka here becomes the figure through which we can best understand what was to come in the 90s. But before I turn to the 90s, I also have this unique chapter 4, which orients itself towards the male-dominated group that has become one of the most well-known collectives coming out of Yugoslavia in the 1980s, Neue Slowenische Kunst, offering a feminist critique and rereading of the collective and specific works. Chapter 4 hones in on the principal role of Ida Čufer, and you see her here on the left, and the theater group, Scipio Nasic's Sisters Theater, active in the 1980s, or when they were active in the 1980s. While this chapter reveals the woman question to be a blind spot in an otherwise radically critical art collective, it also offers a rereading of NSK's theater subgroup through the lens of gender by honing in on feminist spirituality as a form of covert resistance against the state-mandated nationalism. The last chapter focuses on understanding how the Yugoslav wars impacted Yugoslav feminism and anti-nationalism in the 1990s and thereafter. Including the emergence of one of the most important women activist groups of the region, Women in Black, shown protesting here on the left. And then you see a work by Selma Salman. I'll return to her again. And here you see Women in Black again on the left, and a woman in Kosovo fighting against the ethnic violence of the Serbs. Centering on women's distressed positions as survivors of civil war and the loss of a homeland, this chapter expands the field of inquiry to include also popular images of Yugoslav women during the wars, including beauty contestants, this very famous image, and also soldiers and snipers. And this has become very interesting with the surge of the Ukrainian war now, that also has been where images of snipers, female snipers, are circulating. This chapter also looks at the new generation, like Selma Salman, who was 2 or 3 years old when the Yugoslavia deteriorated. And here you see on the left something that she posted this week, which shows the artist as a young child and her aunt holding an automatic weapon during the war. And her brother is on her aunt's side, also holding a gun. So this legacy of the gun and the sniper is actually very interesting in terms of the female figures who raised this new generation and who had to confront war. On the left, a few years ago, Selma categorized herself as a Jugoslovenka, further complicating and enriching this identity to include a new generation of artists who identify with this long-lost country. Born in 1991, long after Tito's death and right at the time of the burgeoning wars, the legal rights for Roma worsened significantly after socialism and the rise of neoliberal capitalism, especially for Salma's community in Vujica, where Tito's era of socialism is remembered as a time when everything was perfect. And I also want to acknowledge that today is International Romani Day. So it's very it's also moving to present this work, and reminds us again how potent and politically important this question is. Salman also reminds us that the era of Yugoslavia and the era of Jugoslovenka is far from over. If a young woman originally from Bosnia, ethnic Roma, living in the United States and Europe and working as a performance artist internationally lives and breathes the life of Yugoslavia and Jugoslovenka, then we might indeed deduce that the political project was destroyed by nationalism and neoliberal capitalism and patriarchal movements, but that its feminist and multi-ethnic legacies live on in the bodies of the new generation of Yugoslav women. I want to conclude with Shelia Kamarich, whose work is featured on the cover of my book. This photograph was taken in 1994 during the siege of Sarajevo. I chose this work from 1994 for the cover because it reveals some of the interrelated and paradoxical elements within Yugoslav emancipatory feminism, while it also speaks to the harsh realities of Yugoslav women living through the 1990s wars. The attachment to fashion, along with the lingering sexiness with which many feminists might critique, especially, thinking about the absurdity of both in the frame of war, marks Yugoslav feminist performance politics that I think are very powerful. Women performance artists are often charged with narcissism, with being too beautiful, and when they're not, especially when they're not non-white or non-Western, with self-exoticization. But the story here is more complex. Wearing the short and see-through camouflage shirt revealing her breasts with matching pants and standing with one foot resting on a large automatic rifle, Kamarich poses like a model, exposing her slender figure and donning a melancholic and mysterious facial expression so typical for images of models. She says, "This photo was taken during the hardest and most brutal part of my life." And she added, "But the image also shows something else." At the time, Kamarich did not claim to be performing as an artist or engaging in what is categorized as performance art proper, but her performance politics of resistance were clear nevertheless. Already in 1994, her sexy body is hers, the gun is at her feet, she's dangerous, and she possesses dignity and courage. Many examples in the history of art and visual culture mark women's emancipatory politics within the embrace of guns, such as Wally Export's Action Pants, Genital Panic, reenacted, of course, by one of the most famous women from the region, Marina Abramovic, and her 7 easy pieces in the Guggenheim Museum in 2005. Considering the history of the Yugoslav wars and Abramovic's partisan parents' participation in the war, her reenactment of Export's radical feminist action paired with an actual photograph of Kamarich during the war heightens the context of both artists' Yugoslav backgrounds, a burden not present in Export's action in 1969, but a burden many women facing violent patriarchy have to face every day. Another burden, which neither Export nor Abramovic had to face, lies just beneath the surface, but is equally relevant for women's struggles against patriarchy, especially in Bosnia during the early 1990s, trying to find work in an environment where being taken advantage of was normalized and death was imminent. The photograph here shows Kamarich in a phase of her life when she worked as a model, a job made most difficult under the circumstances of war. At this time of the war, Kamarich remembers a kilo of sugar was worth 100 Deutschmarks in the underground market. The photographer who came to shoot her and some other women had come to Bosnia from Italy, and he offered to pay Kamarich and the other models with sugar, for which he had undoubtedly only paid a negligible amount of Deutschmarks in Italy. While one might wonder in shock what kind of thought went through his mind calculating the profits he might make by taking advantage of struggling young women in war profiteering on the backs of women was hardly a new trade. The models knew very well what he was trying to do, cursed him out, and demanded fair pay. This story, crowning the cover, gives but a glimpse into the innumerable ways that Yugoslav emancipatory resistance was deeply embedded in the visual history and the continued work of Yugoslav feminists and artists. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jasmina. That was fantastic. Very good. And Amelia, do you want to give your response, and then we'll turn to Lindsay and then questions from the crowd?
Yeah, sure. That was really wonderful, kind of reliving the different premises and chapters. So I wanted to say a little bit about the series that the book is in, and then kind of what I feel it's doing that in some ways exemplifies the loftiest goals of the series. So we're super excited to have it in there. The Rethinking Arts History series at Manchester University Press was conceived by myself and Marcia Meskimmin with the help of on-the-ground editor Emma Brennan when I was still teaching at University of Manchester around 2009. And the first book came out in 2010. And I'm going to put the link in the chat so that people can take a look while I'm describing some of the books. The series aims to open out art history and the study of visuality and the body and visual arts from their most basic structures. The idea is to foreground work that challenges the conventional periodization and geographical subfields of, most obviously art history, but also related disciplines, and to address a wide range of visual culture forms from the early modern period to the present. So it's quite notable that the series is not called Art History, it's Rethinking Arts Histories. And by art, we're really looking very broadly at visuality, performance, visual culture, etc. So some of the books that I've been kind of re-engaging with recently, and I really love these books. I'll just name a few of the titles, starting with the oldest books and moving to the most recent, which would include Jasmina's book. Siobhan Shilton's book, Transcultural Encounters, Visualizing France and the Maghreb in Contemporary Art. Rosemarie San Juan, Vertiginous Mirrors, the animation of the visual image in early modern travel. And we really are trying to get more kind of pre-20th century material, just sending the word out there. This book, for example, traces the journey of visual images through colonization. It's a really interesting book. But there are a lot of more contemporary focused books, such as Ara Osterweil's Flesh Cinema, The Corporeal Turn in American Avant-Garde Film, Dominic Johnson's Glorious Catastrophe on Jack Smith, the book I co-edited with Aaron Silver, Otherwise Imagining Queer Feminist Art Histories, Mia Banyeras, Coloring the Caribbean, Alpesh Patel, Productive Failure, Writing Queer Transnational South Asian Art Histories, Niharika Dinkar's Empires of Light, Vision, Visibility, and Power in Colonial India, Jane Chin Davidson's Staging Art and Chineseness, The Politics of Transnationalism and Global Expositions, Andy Campbell's Bound Together, Leather, Sex, Archives, and Contemporary Art, Ming Ma's There Is No Soundtrack, Rethinking Art, Media, and the Audiovisual Contract. So the I Am Jugoslovenka, just I think beautifully complements this really eclectic range of books in that it takes on, through a kind of deep history and analysis, a very particular moment and kind of visual production. So the books focus not just on the works by artists formerly excluded from Euro-American art historical canons, nor solely on so-called non-Western or non-Euro-US topics, but really our interest is in research that offers entirely new frameworks to think about art, visual culture, performance, and related aspects of art's histories. So again, we're interested in books that, whether explicitly or implicitly, really challenge the structures through which kind of the conventional art world functions. They are by and large not art history books, although some of them are. We're not interested in additive approaches, as I said, rather in books that really structurally interrogate through new perspectives and frameworks. And I think when I was thinking about it, I thought of 3 different ways in which most of the books function, and then I'll position your book, Jasmina, as I see it, kind of fitting into these innovative methodologies. I think the first kind of book is the one that digs into a very specific visual or performance history or case studies in a vertical way, kind of looking really deeply at fairly contained moment and place in order to really change how we think about really kind of modern visual culture histories. And also to question what art is or can be, what it can do, what it even means to talk about art and performance. I think, the way that you look across kind of visual culture, performance, I think very clearly does that. Some of them offer alternative modes of historical thinking and writing in relation to visuality and embodiment in contexts in and beyond the Western European and North American, the usual kind of normative context. And I think, we've been very lucky that scholars such as yourself over the last 25 years have really put pressure on the idea of Europe as really just Western Europe. And really looking deeply at what it can provide by way of a broader understanding to take very seriously practices in Eastern Europe. And of course, as you say, Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, is an interesting case because it really is the most Western of the Eastern European context. And then others of the books, as you could hear from the titles, address transcultural visual and performance cultures, and really just look at kind of eroding the boundaries and thinking about a broader range of examples. So again, I see your book as exemplifying both the kind of vertical dig into a particular cultural and historical moment, and the confident use of a range of methodological tools to produce a refreshing new way of thinking about an under-historicized and under-theorized, situation, I think is the best way to talk about it. It's a nationalist situation, but it's also a cultural situation, including a number of case studies. I think that you convincingly use feminism in a really fresh way, kind of challenging the assumption that it aligns with the spoken commitments of the artist. And I'd be interested in hearing, as you know, I have nattered at Marina Abramovic in various articles and so on. And what does it mean to insist that her work has feminist effects, I think is a really powerful set of arguments. Arriving at a nuanced understanding of gendered embodiment as central to state and cultural politics. So you're not looking at it as a kind of unimportant kind of side issue, but actually as constituting Yugoslavian nationalism or its kind of countering of that nationalism. I'm going to quote you on pages 23, 24, because I just love this kind of crystallizes for me what I think the book is doing. Performance works in Yugoslavia from this, in this case, you're looking at 70s and 80s, are fascinating because women's emphasis on their bodies offered a different idea of the Yugoslav national body, pushing the body and sexuality of women to the center of the art scenes. And then you go on to suggest that our understanding of socialist embodiment changes radically with a look at women's contributions. And that's kind of just the ambition of saying that what Yugoslavia looks like completely changes when we look at it through this work. That's exactly what we're trying to do with the series, that kind of ambition. Yes, I'll just close by saying that the book is a stellar example of the kinds of revisionist and visionary work we feature in the series through its thoughtful ways of rethinking a cultural moment that have ramifications across broader Euro-American histories and theories of the relationship between bodies and politics.
Thank you so much, Amelia. That's a great way to get us started. And Lindsay, why don't you offer your commentary as well at this point?
Fantastic. I will. I'm going to try to keep it a little bit short so we make sure we have time to talk to all of our attendees who might have questions as well. I want to, first of all, thank all of the colleagues in the room, both for this invitation and for the chance to engage with Jasmina's book, which is such a gift. I'm also a little humbled because of the depth and the breadth of the expertise that this book evidences. I find it very compelling, but also a little intimidating. So I'll do my best. I come to this work from my own place, right? I'm not an art historian or a visual studies person. I work in performance studies. So opening the cover of this book, I came with a fairly conventional, for my university experience, preparation for like thinking about feminist performance art from almost entirely a US and European standpoint, Western European standpoint. So one of the first things that I remarked upon the book was how ably Jasmina sort of details the feminist discontents within the Yugoslav project, which was unfamiliar to me, but so compelling, especially when she begins to discuss how a feminist performance politics evolves, that for me both evokes the histories of US performance artists, feminist performance artists, but also sort of undoes the paradigmatic status of US and Western artists, at least for an audience like me. And of particular interest was the way that she deftly demonstrates artists considering their own embodiment relative to Tito's, and to like sort of a national socialist identity or a body that's figured as masculine or male, and also in some cases really remarkably placing their own bodies into that political discourse, as in some of the slides that Jasmina showed in her presentation. The relation of feminist practice and performance, and even sort of presentation of self, to discourses of consumption and beauty and decorativeness was very compelling to me. It feels like a very different relationship to femme beauty standards, or sort of, I don't really like using the term identity, but like a femme aesthetic generally, than the one that I was schooled in. And I'm going to read a little bit because there are a couple of parts that I highlighted to share with you today. One is in reference to what I just said about sort of femme beauty standards and the performance of beauty. Jasmina writes really compellingly about the, hold on, I gotta find exactly the phrase, to the culture of painted fingernails. There's a beautiful image in this book. I don't know if you're gonna be able to see it if I hold it up, but no, because I have my weird blur turned on. But there's this beautiful picture. It's a poster for a performance based on Erica Jong's Fear of Flying. That's just a painted nail flipping the bird, if you can say that. There's probably a better way. Anyway, there's this picture, and she writes that nails are connected to a cultural colonization that reveals tensions with patriarchal power and complicates coherent narratives about feminism and socialism in Yugoslavia. And when I read this book, that move, the complicating of a coherent narrative, just comes up again and again as Jasmina tries to, as she very ably creates a relationship between things that don't always fit nicely together. She writes really compellingly also about, oh yes, there it is. Thank you, whoever magician just did that. It's pretty cool, right?
Yeah, I did that.
Thank you. You are a magician, Jasmina. She writes really compellingly of a Yugoslav femininity that's not bound to traditional gender roles, such as socialist expectations of motherhood or honest work, which for me is a really different valence to the debates around sort of beauty and consumption through feminist practices. And then later in the book, she writes, and actually, Jasmina, you quoted the same part, so I'm going to like come up with something new on the fly. She writes of the artist Selma Selman, if a young ethnic Roma woman originally from Bosnia living in the USA and working as a performance artist internationally lives and breathes the life of Yugoslavia and Jugoslovenka, then we might indeed deduce that while the Yugoslav political project was destroyed by nationalism and neoliberal capitalism in the early 1990s, its feminist and multi-ethnic legacies live on in the bodies of new generations of Yugoslav women. This is directly across the page from a sentence in which Jasmina cites Yugoslav women turning towards preserving their dignity and caring for their outer appearance in the same sentence that she describes them taking arms against a patriarchal military aggression, noting them both as potent strategies against oppression. I'll leave maybe with one more tiny observation from the conclusion. And that's that Jasmina does such an unusually granular job of unpacking the layers and states of being a woman, these are her words, in one of the most progressive, if also deeply patriarchal, political experiments that followed World War II, that is socialist Yugoslavia. She writes that she hopes this book can change how we understand the gendered history of 20th century socialism and its relevance today. And for me, that's exactly what this book does. I'm so pleased to have gotten to spend this amount of time with it and to be able to discuss it with all of you. And I think we'll move to questions. Carrie, is that next?
Yes, thank you so much, Lindsay. That is wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you both.
All right. Feel free to raise your hand, to unmic yourself, to post a question in the chat box if you prefer. To get us started, I'm going back to Marina Abramovic, and Amelia mentioned Marina's contentious relationship to feminism. And I was wondering if you could comment, Jasmina and Amelia, you're welcome to as well, and Lindsay too, about the memoir that she published where she referred to Australian Aborigines as dinosaur-like because they have bloated stomachs and stick-like legs. And, I was just wondering, what is the construction of whiteness for these artists in terms of their feminism, and how do you make sense of it? I know, Jasmina, you write about the Orientalist trope in her earlier work. And I was just interested in what you make sense of this memoir from 2016 and the kind of settler assumptions in it.
Yeah. I mean, Marina Abramovic really knows how to upset a lot of people. I think a lot of people get upset reading her memoir. And there's a lot of things in there that also really, rattled me. But the task I saw ahead of myself is to really think about, okay, how can we dismiss an artist who does body-centered work, who thinks about endurance, whose work does a lot of, rethinking the socialist system and the woman's body in relation to it, in relation to men's bodies, just based on what the artist has written or said. So instead of kind of dismissing her or saying, okay, she's, ignorant about colonial legacy, she's, uses language that is outdated and offensive. And especially for those of us who work on former Yugoslavia, she constantly, was saying things that it's such a dark, ugly, drab place. It is so awful. But of course, that's not the story I tell at all. And actually, I read against that. But for me, it wasn't really at stake. Correcting what she's saying wasn't at stake. I was more interested in excavating the emancipatory potential in the work itself, apart from her. And I did that because I think that, a lot of us have to deal with this who work on feminist work, is that the trends in feminism and what is considered feminist, what is considered politically progressive and what not, change over time. And actually they also change with the political circumstances. And that's something else that I didn't present on today, but that I talk about in the book, is when certain women identified as feminists versus not, and how these kinds of things also shift over time. So I really liberated myself from kind of having to adhere to that, because if I had, I couldn't have used the cover maybe, because already I had gotten pushback. How can a hot naked woman be emancipatory, right? Like, is that even possible? How can Vlasta Delamar's work be emancipatory? Like, a lot of people have criticisms of that, but you know, my quest was really to focus on a very particular aspect that tells us A, something about Yugoslavia and the project itself, and B, does so through the lens of Jugoslovenka, not only feminist Jugoslovenka, but Jugoslovenka as she lives and breathes. And how could I dismiss the most famous artist in the world doing performance art from the region? I would not. So I feel like she's such an amazing example, because she's complex, and I love those examples. There's no simple history, and she will always, I think she will continue, you know, to make these kinds of to cause outrage. And I myself, like Amelia I have been critical of the work. You know, it's not the question of whether or not she's politically it's sort of in solidarity with other struggling areas. That's not even something I'm really thinking about when I write about her work. That's not really at stake. That's more the activist groups, women in Black, who are very careful and who think very carefully through their positionality and their geographical location, their political solidarity, and so on and so forth. That's really not something that's at stake for Marina Abramovic. I hope that answered a little bit your question.
Yeah, very much so. You bring on the contradictions. You're not trying to smooth them over. But welcome. Amelia, did you want to comment on that particular artist, on Abramovic in particular, before we go to
I guess I would say that I learned so much about the relationship with anti-fascism and kind of the way that you contextualize her. Yeah. You know, and of course I knew the general stories about her parents and what they did and Tito's regime and all that, but it really helped nuance a way of looking at where she was coming from. So I appreciated that. I have lots to say about this problem of, you know, talking about something as having feminist effects or potential when the artist is overtly anti-feminist in her statements. But I think you deal with it really well in the book. I know that Elizabeth has a question.
Yeah, Libby, why don't you unmute and...
Hey, everybody. I'm also in California here with Amelia. That's why we're having a heat wave. Not trying to rub it in, just explain why I'm dressed like this. So thank you, everybody. This was so great. And it's been wonderful to watch Jasmina do this book over the years and kind of, decide to make a pop star kind of a serious feminist icon, and to kind of name this trope, which is really enduring and I think everybody has seen, but nobody's really seen. So I think mine is sort of a question comment. But it truly is a question. I think what you've done here is really create a kind of new body of works to consider together. And you're doing this while you're talking also to multiple audiences, right? You're speaking to artists and feminists and scholars in the region, but also here. And the knowledge base is totally different, as your commentators have also pointed out. And I guess I just wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on that process and how that was, how you feel about it looking back, and how it might inform your next project, which is centered both in that region and then beyond it.
And that's such a great question. And I think all of us who are, working outside of the particular context are negotiating that very position of, how do you publish a book with an American or, or North European press? while you also honor, speak that language and speak and use the terms and use the narratives that make sense, while also honoring, of course, and being faithful to the work within the region itself. I think it's a really, really hard process. And I think there's probably 20 people here who could also comment on those struggles. One of the struggles I had was getting publishers actually interested in the story of Yugoslavia outside of the region. I'm not going to comment on the region itself because I did not contact presses in the region, but outside of Yugoslavia, the argument that I heard most is that it's too narrow. It's not really, Yugoslavia is too narrow of a field. It is, performance is interesting, but Yugoslavia, not so much. And then I had to really also think about, okay, I studied, all this performance history. What do I do with it? Like, I can't just apply what I studied. Like, I want to, of course, also read the regional context. So there's some middle way there because I work in the United States. I would go and be in the archives as much as possible and meet and interview artists as much as possible. But my insight is going to be extremely shaped by my diasporic identity as someone who left Yugoslavia at age 7, who grew up in Germany and then came to the United States and somehow had this extraordinary opportunity to focus on former Yugoslavia and in fact also on Hungary for my PhD, and now for this book really hone in on a very particularly narrow field. So for me, this book was all about making the argument that we must look at Yugoslavia, and we must not only look at Yugoslavia, we must look at the visual culture and art through the lens of feminism. And of course, there have been amazing studies recent ones, Sofia Lorenz, the challenge to Yugoslav socialism, the feminist challenge to Yugoslav socialism was an extremely important resource. And she writes from, is from Hungary, but writes also on the region. And then Jelena Petrovic, and I don't know if they're here because I can't see everyone. I would have to leaf through. They have already published so much on the region. Marina Abramovic, who is also in my talk, has really written a lot about the history of feminism. So I very much relied on them, and Bojana Pejic, who curated one of the first exhibitions, Gender Check, dealing with the question of gender in Eastern Europe was, so there's been a lot of work preceding this that I built on. Diana Jelacha is another example who's published multiple volumes, including, really looking at the feminist politics of the region, not only during socialism, but after. So I'm really building on that type of work, while I'm also trying to speak to an audience that doesn't know the region at all. So it's kind of a complex task, and I think before everyone got here, Kari said it was a very ambitious project, but for me, and maybe this goes beyond your question, but it really was this idea of how do I understand, you saw this photo of my mom, and how do I understand this feminist legacy that has sort of been pushed onto me since I was a little child? And that's really where it all began for me, really thinking about, that's also why I thought about beauty, and I thought about sort of the way, what we wear and how we act and what that means. And for me, performance art and that includes, of course, also these concerts and really moving in the world and being looked at and having the signification was really important. Okay, I went off on a tangent now, I'm sorry.
No, but there was a lot of people who appreciated the picture of yourself as a child. It was absolutely precious. And then I had the realization that I'm the same generation as your mother from her fashion, although I never had a mullet. Joanna, you wanted to ask Schuster Craig, did you want to unmic yourself and ask your question?
Hi, so I am not an art historian. I work on German studies, but I am really curious about the video piece that you played without sound twice. Mm-hmm. So I work on right-wing extremism, and the visual kind of reference that this brings to mind for me is the Theo van Gogh Dutch film of Ayaan Hirsi Ali's body projected with verses from the Quran, which is for absolutely different political purposes than the video piece that you showed. But what stuck with me was thinking about the images of genocide that are so masculine, that are in the background, and then the possible subtext that women are able to feel more and thus could critically comment on what was happening. And so I was curious how you might engage as a feminist critic with that idea of the feeling female body.
That's really interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way. I was more interested in how the artist chose the gaze, you know, that it's like her vision. But yeah, that's a very interesting dimension, and certainly a trope, of course, in that women are more sensitive. But the other thing that's really interesting is that a lot of the time, and this is something I write about in my book, women are shown as, you know, in more like as suffering, as you know, often elderly women with scarves, or like, you know, there's a lot of sort of ways in which there's a reductionist view of women. But the sexy or beautiful women, on one hand, yeah, we can read her as feeling more. And on the other hand, if she's beautiful, often there's more projection on her as being a kind of symbol of feeling the war. So the Miss Sarajevo contest is a very good example, which became, you know, a very important part of the music video for U2 with Luciano Pavarotti, really kind of thinking about her beauty being the marker of her innocence in many ways. And so there's also often a collapsing of beauty, not only the ways in which, you know, her body is laying in this in by locations, which is the work you're referencing, but also by her beauty. It kind of complicates the political reading there. I like it. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. And the video is longer. That was just one little part of it. So I should have mentioned that. And I only replayed it because I describe it, but it's much longer, and I write about more elements of the video actually in the book as well. So cool. Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Yeah.
Alex, did you want to unmic yourself?
Sure. First of all, congratulations, the presentation, and I can't wait to read the book, but the presentation was incredible and also badass and necessary. But I want to ask a question, which is, I think a lot of what you describe in the sort of social phenomena and feminist action in the US, I think it's fair to say would be framed as being leftist or possibly like on the fringe of our culture, and you integrate so much of pop culture in your reference. And so I'm curious to know, like, how do you understand and how would you describe for us the extent to which this kind of feminist action and way of life is part of pop culture versus like on the fringes?
Oh yeah, that's a very good question. So yeah, the risk is that this book gives this impression that like feminism was just everywhere. It was super popular and everybody supported it. Of course, that's not what it was, but you know, I'm trying to kind of highlight in the smallest ways in which like these signals are being sort of sent out. So in the chapter that deals with avant-garde art, I mean, there is one of the things I write about is that a lot of like women curators were doing the work on the ground, and that actually the student cultural centers, and there's a lot of scholarship being done on that, you know, had pretty high visibility for people interested in avant-garde art, but it wasn't like something that people would take their school classes to or anything. It's not really, you know, the avant-garde circles are usually not that, but that's also true here in the United States. Now, Lepa Brena and Esmarečepova is a whole nother story. So they were, you know, playing on television, playing in the kafanas, you know, just something that I grew up, and I think a lot of us, maybe even you, I don't know, grew up listening to and looking at over and over again these videos. And one of the things I write about is that there has been a recent interest in, for example, the figure of Lepa Brena with the Lepa Brena project that has been playing, you know, in Belgrade, where it's these queer and feminist curators kind of looking at that very legacy that informed them as young teenagers to kind of gain confidence in themselves and resist and wear great fashion, you know, like really just sort of looking at how pervasive her influence was, despite the fact that, of course, she's also known as an extreme capitalist now, you know. So I write about that paradox as well. You know, these women that I write about, they're not just like this one simple story, but I think the lesson really for me was big in that regard, because when I first started the project, when I really started thinking about it years ago, I had a very particular line of thinking about it. And I thought, okay, they were all anti-fascist, feminist, you know, I just had this like projected fantasy on what they were serving. And then when you look into their lives, and Abramovic, of course, I didn't have that fantasy, but there were many other kind of situations, even the Yugoslav project itself, then you see that there's a lot of, you know, contradictions. And that's also true for Yugoslavia itself. So on one hand, you have all this visual culture, Lipa Brena, you know, you have this famous Marina Abramovic already exhibiting internationally in 75, coming out of the region. You have Esma Rečepova from all over the world. But then on the other hand, you know, you have the staunchly patriarchal society. So how we measure that access and the popularity is really difficult. And actually, one of my political commitments with this book was to write it in a way, and I worked with, you know, editors doing this, where, you know, my mom could read it maybe, you know, or someone and could still comprehend it, to really have more access to this, like the potential of feminist resistance in that project, to make it more accessible to a larger audience who might glean something from it and who's not, you know, trained in avant-garde performance studies, feminist theory, you know. So this was like really, really an important political commitment to me, because the cultural context had shaped so much of what I kind of believe or think about. So I hope that answers your question, at least in part. Of course, I also look a little bit at film in the book. But in general, it's a very big mix. So you can't really sort of just categorize. And, you know, the other thing, of course, there's so many more examples. I mean, my book was already supposed to be 90,000 words. It's 115,000. You know, I really had to, like, it was like, end, stop, no more examples, you know. And so now for my second book, I'm really excited to actually look at more contemporary work of the last like 3 decades. And because of this book, I've started to also form new connections with younger artists who have really found this relationship to Yugoslavia super important, but who haven't really like had any, you know, kind of a reference point. And now they have like this little first kind of dip into that long, like complicated history. And it's my hope that actually more projects will come out of this by other people, and that like we're connecting across the world, this is my fantasy, and start really like reshaping that legacy and think about potentials, you know, like political potentials and potentials in the arts. But I don't want to go on and on about my excitement.
But I think one of the key points about, and this goes back to Libby's question as well, Jasmina, is this book, you have such a clear sense of the story you want to tell and what's at stake. And I think that is the key to the clarity of it, what this project is and what it's not.
But it's also like one of the things that's so unique to me, it's not unique, but like really remarkable about this book is the way that it doesn't overly narrativize the history that you're trying to present. Like it's not fully cogent. Like you were talking about how there's a lot of sexy women in this book, and they're in the midst of a really patriarchal society. For me, this is the section where you talk about sex and porn is maybe where that comes to the front the most, where there are things that are really hard to not justify, but to reconcile with one another throughout this book. Yeah. So it's a really beautiful genealogy that maybe doesn't always coalesce into story from my perspective.
No, and it's not supposed to. Thank you for saying that. And I have to say, as someone who I wanted the book done really quick. I was like, can I get it done already? You know, I have a deadline. I'm going up for 10 years. But I had to sort of constantly go back to, these incoherences. Like, how do I tell the story without telling a coherent, like, because the feminist movement, it was not one thing, you know, I wasn't really interested in writing about one movement. I was interested in looking at feminist work within all these individual things. So anyway, I see Yelena has her hand up. Hi.
Yeah, hi, congratulations, Jasmina.
Thank you.
You touched on this a couple of times already, so I just, maybe I kind of missed it, or maybe I'm just looking for like a little bit more background given my kind of lack of background in here, but I'm curious about like the relationship of Yugoslavenka to like Yugoslav consumer culture, and if there's like a culture, a critique of consumer culture there, like how you kind of treat it in the book. Thanks.
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And others, you know, have done such a phenomenal job of doing this. I'm thinking here about also Ivana Bago has a fantastic essay on thinking through consumer culture, also in the work of Sanja Vekovic. And Sanja Vekovic, again, is one of the most prominent artists who comes up. She really engages with also consumer culture and critiquing, you know, the patriarchal elements within consumer culture. So I don't really engage otherwise. I don't look at commercials. I didn't go through sort of I didn't go in the TV archives. That would be a phenomenal project, and I would love to sort of really think about that. But the way I kind of thought through consumer culture is by looking at feminist critiques of consumer culture. And Sanja Vekovic was one of the most prominent artists for that. Yeah. Thank you.
As we're winding down here, I think we're ending at 3:30. I just wanted to throw out the question, what is Yugo nostalgia? And let me throw this also, and maybe Amelia can comment on this, but I've noticed a lot of our students are very nostalgic for the 1980s, whether, you know, my dad bought me a record player and I was able to use my vinyl records and all that, or Ferris Bueller or The Breakfast Club and all of that. There's all this 1980s nostalgia happening with this generation. But what is the nostalgia that you're talking about? And I just was wondering, how is it a kind of template for a future movement, if that's what it is?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Yugo nostalgia is, as a concept, also something people are really interested in writing about and have been writing about for a while. For me, my first encounter with really thinking through came when the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York, had this you know, fantastic show of Yugoslav architecture. And I had seen Marina Abramovic's retrospective and Sanja Vekovic, and then years later, you know, we have this amazing Yugoslav show, and I kind of approached it intellectually. I was like, okay, I want to see now how good this is. But then I was there and I was overwhelmed with feelings, and I was like, tears, and I'm hearing like people from the region. I hear, you know, the language in this like New York posh context, and it undid me, you know. And I thought for the first time, I was like, we are worthy of like, it's like I am going to fight for this Yugoslav project because it's worthy of being talked about, you know. I'm not going to take no for an answer anymore, you know. And then I pitched this review of the show to Art Monthly and said, I want to make it about Yugo nostalgia, and I want to make it about not just about the show, but also about Yugoslav women, because there were several things that were happening. So that's my entry point into Yugo nostalgia. Yugo nostalgia also counters a lot of the kind of nationalist emergence. So like in the 90s, you know, the separation into different republics, different nations. So being kind of enchanted with the Yugoslav project can also mean that you're anti the new, most of the time it means you're really not necessarily on board with the new nationalist project. So it has a lot of like incredibly important political potential, because Yugoslavia as a multi-ethnic, multicultural nation, you know, to think about it, the potentiality of connecting and you know, cohering a very fragmented, warred, you know, area is extraordinary. And many of us, you know, even in North America, I think Bojana Videkanic and Katja Praznik are here as well. You know, we've really you know, committed ourselves to thinking about Yugoslavia as this transnational project that has this potential to critique capitalism, to critique, you know, patriarchal conditions today, to critique, you know, very sort of reductive stories of socialism. Both of them, for example, really expanded, how we like the revolutionary potential of Yugoslavia as an idea when Bojana Videkanich's work really looking at non-alignment, and Praznik really looking at and I know Praznik will also give a talk for your series, so you all should come for Katya's book talk, which will be exciting, really thinking through the question of labor, but there are many more, right? And so I think for me the most interesting and political potential of thinking of Yugo nostalgia is transcending the nationalist divisions and thinking about the potential of socialist revolution and feminist revolution.
Thank you. So it's an absolutely loaded term of critique as well as a vision.
Yeah, and there's a lot to critique too, but I'm sorry?
Did you coin it?
Oh, no.
That's a great. Katya, did you want to speak? Did you want to unmic? I don't want to put her on the spot spontaneously like that. But if anyone has any final words. Oh, Judith.
I just wanted to say.
Oh, there's Katya. Okay.
Sorry, we are sitting here with Bojana in my kitchen and we are getting ready for the book launch party. We haven't started drinking rakia yet, but anyway, thank you, Jasmina, so much for this very inspiring presentation, and I'm really, really excited, and I congratulate you a lot. But yeah, I think at this point, I don't have any, I mean, I have questions, but I think I would prefer other people ask them. Mine was more related to the question of the working, the class dimension of these artists that Jasmina engaged, which I think is also an interesting point in her book, because there's a lot of people who would belong to the socialist middle classes and people who were from the working classes, and I think that that's a really important aspect there. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Going back to making the cake.
It's like we have 2 minutes left, but Judith is there. Hi, Judith.
Hi. I just wanted to say how much I agree with Libby's comment about how this book creates a new body of works to consider together. And I just wanted to say that this book is such a brilliant, amazing, creative, like really visionary, as Amelia was saying, achievement, and just bring that forward, you know, thinking of yourself as a historian and critic, but you are also one of the brilliant artistic creative minds here. And it's just so impressive and beautiful and courageous. And it's just a beautiful work.
Thank you so much.
Well said, Judith. Well said. And that's a great way to conclude, actually, with that summary. That is absolutely true, Jasmina, and I just want to congratulate you for this huge achievement.
Oh, thank you so much. This was an incredible opportunity to share my work. Thanks for everybody who came and for your feedback. And yeah, let's continue the conversation about Yugoslavia.
And Amelia, thank you for joining us from Los Angeles. Really appreciate it. And Lindsay as well. I know you're out there for the next few weeks.
I'm also in LA, weirdly. Sorry.
I wish we all could have had it there.
I know.
All right. Stay well, everyone, and have a great weekend. And thanks for joining us.